So we're back here this morning in kind of a tucked away corner of our garden where we have our compost pile. As you can see, it's a very simple setup. We just kind of slapped it together with pallets, so it was virtually free. There's all kinds of pre-made systems you can buy, like tumblers and metal boxes. And if you have pests in your compost area, like rats or raccoons, those could be worth investing in. For us, this really simple, cheap setup works perfectly well for giving us what we need, which is beautiful finished compost for our plants. So there's a few reasons why gardeners should all be composting at home. And the number one is that it gives you something to do with all your fruit and veggie scraps and your yard debris and garden waste. When you're done with it for the season, you can put it in your compost pile. It's also very good for the planet. When you're transporting all of these heavy compostable materials, obviously that takes fossil fuels, and when they go to the landfill and they start to break down in an oxygen-free environment, they emit methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. On the contrary, when you take all of your materials and put them in an oxygenated environment like a compost pile, they break down into nutrients and organic matter, and they emit some carbon dioxide, but that's a much less potent gas than methane. But of course, the main reason that everybody should have a compost pile for their garden is for this stuff, the black gold right here. So plants really thrive in a garden with a lot of added compost. It provides organic matter and nutrients. It has a lot of beneficial soil organisms that will improve your soil structure. And if you have really heavy clay or really sandy soil, it can help bring that back into balance in terms of your composition and texture. And today we're going to talk to you about 3 different methods that you can compost at home and really kind of close the loop on your garden in terms of nutrients. And those are hot composting, cold composting, and vermicomposting. Cold composting, sometimes called no rules composting, is the simplest method for home gardeners because you can slowly add materials to the pile over time. You should choose a spot to begin your pile, and every time you add vegetable scraps, garden residue, or grass clippings, add a layer of leaves, straw, or other dry brown plant material as well. After several months, or even up to a year, the bottom of the pile will begin to look like usable compost. At that point, you can dig that out to use in your garden, leaving the rest of the pile to continue breaking down. Keep in mind that any seeds that enter your cold compost pile, from fruits, vegetables, or weeds, will still likely be viable when the compost is ready. The same is true of many fungal diseases on spent garden plants. So be very careful about where you use the finished compost to prevent spreading weed seeds and fungal disease in your garden beds, and do your best to keep out diseased plant matter or weed seeds from the compost to begin with. So hot composting, which is what this pile here is the most commonly used system for commercial composters as well as more advanced home gardeners. And the reason they like it is because it is the quickest way to get usable compost. Additionally, the heat that's generated in the process will kill weed seeds and a lot of the fungal and bacterial diseases for plants. So it generates a more consistent product to use in your garden. When you're starting a hot compost pile, you generally want to add everything all at once so you can get enough mass built up to have that heat. And you want a 1-to-1 ratio of brown material to green material. Brown material refers to things like leaves, straw, even shredded up paper products, generally stuff that's carbon rich. And then green refers to nitrogen rich materials like plant scraps. So for example, here we have a bunch of old bean plants that we're just going to chop up and layer in about a 1-to-1 ratio with the leaves. You want to add them all together in at least a 3-foot by 3-foot pile so that, again, all of that bacteria that's going to heat up your pile has enough space to work with and you have enough mass. The piles of green and brown plant material create the perfect environment for microorganisms that decompose plant material and form compost. These piles can heat up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit when the microbes are active. To keep track of the activity, you can simply stick your hand into the center of the pile at least once a week. If it feels hot, let it continue. When it starts to cool off, turn the pile with a pitchfork or shovel to reintroduce oxygen and get it heated back up. The turnaround time from plant material to usable compost with these piles can be as short as a month if they are watered and turned regularly. One thing that's good to remember when you're composting is that a compost pile is essentially a colony of living organisms. So like all living organisms, they need oxygen and water to thrive. If you live in a particularly dry environment, you may need to water your compost pile as often as you're watering your garden. Vermicomposting is not as easy as the other forms to do on a large scale at home, but when Jordan and I lived in a small apartment, we were able to still compost by feeding all of our fruit and veggie scraps to worms that lived in a plastic tub in our closet. Nowadays, we like to keep a vermicompost going so that in the winter time, we can feed our scraps to the worms in our basement rather than having to go out in the freezing cold up to our compost pile. The type of worms used in vermicomposting are a little different than what you're used to, and they're called red wigglers. They have a much more voracious appetite than the earthworms that you'll find in most gardens. You can usually find these online easily, and if you keep feeding them, you can actually keep your colony going indefinitely. We've had these just in this tub in our basement for about 6 years now. A very easy, economical way to start a vermicompost system is just with 2 plastic bins that have lids that snap on top. We took this one and we drilled holes in the sides and the bottom. That will make sure oxygen can get in, and also if you happen to get excess liquid in your worm colony, that will drain out. And then we just put that in another one that we didn't drill holes into so that the liquid will drain into that and not the floor. And we keep a lid on it unless we're adding food scraps, so nothing else can get in there and we don't get fly problems. If it does start to get too moist in here, the worms will kind of let you know that they're not happy and they'll start climbing up the sides. And if they do that, the best thing to do is add some kind of material to soak up the moisture. So shredded newspaper works well, straw, things of that nature. You can just put a nice layer over top and it'll kind of soak up that excess moisture. Back up, back up. You can see Moo's very interested, so another reason to keep a lid on your vermicompost. The turnaround time from adding scraps to getting this beautiful vermicast or worm compost is pretty short, and you can make it no ma'am, and you can make it you can make it even shorter by chopping up your veggies into small pieces or even putting them in a blender before you add them to the bin. This will just, increase the surface area and make it easier for the worms to break them down quickly. Another key component of a vermicompost system is to provide some grit for your worms. They have crops similar to chickens, so some kind of sharp, small material to help them digest the food scraps is key. Right now I'm going to add some little bone fragments that we made from some venison bones. You could also use things like finely crushed up eggshells, cornmeal, soil from your garden that has rocks in it, just as long as it's a little gritty. When it comes time to use your vermicompost in the garden, the easiest way we found to get it free of worms is just to start putting all of your food scraps in one section of it. The worms will kind of migrate over to where the food is, and then in the rest of it, there'll be basically no worms, so you can use it for compost tea or other ways to amend your garden. Once you get in the groove of composting, it'll become like second nature and be a really great benefit to your garden.